This is Remote Ruby.
Have you any remote idea to the meaning of the word?
Hello.
Andrew, as a listener of Remote Ruby, which still is weird to me, but as a listener of Remote Ruby, does the show start every time with the little like intro music thing?
Yes.
So that awkward, we hit record and it's like dead silent. And then I'm like, hello, is not as awkward when you listen back to it.
No. I mean,
That's
but
cool.
I also listen to it at 2x speed. So
You listen to all your podcasts at 2x speed?
except for one.
Darknet Diaries?
Yeah. Sometimes it's hard to hear on 2x speed the people he's talking to because the connection on the call may not be very good. So like his audio is always fine at 2x speed, but some of the people he talks to, it's not. So yeah.
How do you have ADHD and listen to that kind of stuff at 2x?
Because I don't pay attention. It just goes into like my brain. Then eventually my brain will fragment itself. And then I'm like, oh, so and it'll just kind of start catching up on like what the intake was.
Okay, I see.
It's not like deep listening. It's like entertainment listening. If I'm trying to learn something, then I will slow it down and like take notes.
Okay, that's an important distinction. If I tell you that Jerry Lee Lewis has died, does that mean anything to you?
No. But
Okay.
yes, in the fact of it's sad when people die. No, in the fact I don't know who that is. It sounds very, very familiar though.
Oh, he was a musician. Well, he was in the Memphis area. I cannot make a statement pro or anti Jerry Lee Lewis if you ever look at his backstory, but
Okay.
it's very fascinating. I delivered a piano to his house one time.
That's interesting.
It's my claim to fame.
You lived an interesting life.
I have nothing of interest to report.
Good. I hope your break is going well. Good.
Break as well. I've been playing a lot of 2K basketball.
Good.
What else have I been doing? I have been working on Jobboardly some.
Cool.
Kind of fun. Made dynamic open graph images.
Me too.
Okay. Tell me how you did it.
I used Vercel and I made like a microservice.
Okay. So you're running like an actual separate process to do this.
Vercel came out with a lot of new stuff this week. And something that came out before this week was this OG image using functions and their API. And I really liked it. So they had a button there like make your own, just press this button, deploy it instantly, and it just works. It's awesome.
That's super cool. I did not go that route. I built mine into a Rails app.
Yeah.
I tried to first use like purely build an image from scratch. That's not me. I tried using not RMagic. What's the one that ships now?
Vips.
Yeah. I got like an image to display, but it looks like my child had like hand drawn something with a ruler on a screen. And then I ended up going the approach of I just have an endpoint that generates the appropriate HTML styled. And then I just take a screenshot of it, save it as a JPEG.
Fair enough.
If you're listening and you've built something like this and you have cool ideas you want to share, I'm open to them. And you can email me all day because I think what I've done is probably trash.
Fair enough.
Did that. And something we can talk about maybe on a later episode. Did a like country and continent multi-select using select.js. I started using the Alpine component for it and then like backtracked into a Stimulus controller. It's very interesting, but it's too much for today because we want to welcome back our friend Kevin Newton. Kevin, thanks for listening to us yell at each other for 5 minutes, and we're excited to talk to you about Ruby.
Thanks for having me.
This is your third appearance?
Second appearance.
Second.
Is it my third? It might be my third. Oh, no.
It's your third.
Oh, gosh.
I think we had one back in the day.
Yeah, I think there's an old one.
Oh, that's true. It is my third appearance. Oh, my goodness. Do I get a jacket? Is there a jacket?
I think you're the second three-peat. Or did Steve move up to 4?
Steve is at 4.
Okay. I think when we hit 5, we need jackets.
That'd be good. Colin's at 3 too, I think. He co-hosted with me last week on the episode that I didn't publish this morning.
I was going to say, you have no proof of that.
No, I have no proof of that except for inward shame.
Paul said, so right now it's Friday, October 28th, 2:11 Central. And Paul said when Andrew emailed to him this morning, he was going to try and get it back to us to send out today.
I hope he just doesn't waste his time on my screw up.
That, or he does it and bills us double the amount.
I'll pay it.
Bet. Kevin, thanks for being back. So seems like even just talking to you for like 5 minutes before, you've got a lot of irons in the fire right now, a lot of cool and exciting stuff happening in Ruby.
All the stuff. So much stuff.
All the Rubies. I think let's start with the parser. So
yes,
I guess it was at Ruby Kaigi.
Mm-hmm.
Is that correct? Where Matt's kind of dropped the news about rewriting the Ruby parser, and that is you solely, you with the team. Where are we at on that?
Yeah, it is a team, but it's not a team just at Shopify, which is kind of interesting. So before the project even began, we wanted to make sure that CRuby was going to be cool with us rewriting the parser. And by us, I mean like just people, like just like rewriting it in general. But there have been tons of folks that have wanted a rewrite of the parser over the years. It has happened myriad times. If you go online and find different examples, there's a dozen different Ruby parsers. And it's because of a lot of reasons, but one of the reasons is you can't really reuse the CRuby parser in other projects because it's tied to CRuby internals. And another reason is maintainability. It's kind of hard to read the parser as it exists. And then the other one is that it doesn't have any error tolerance, which is to say when you have a syntax error in your code, it just chokes on the first one. And with modern IDEs and tooling, for something like TypeScript or Rust or Elm, you're used to seeing all of the errors because it can recover from those syntax errors and then keep parsing. For something like a type checker, you want to have as much of the file as possible in place at all times. And you're only ever typing in one place, right? I mean, I guess sometimes you get a multi-cursor, but for the most part, you're typing in one place. So incremental parsing is an important piece of modern day tooling. Anyway, we had a meeting with the core members of Ruby. I'm talking about Mats, Koichi, Mame, Nobu, Haki, and talked about the possibilities. And they were amenable to the idea of rewriting the parser, but obviously wanted to see some prototyping. And that's when I started prototyping. And then at Ruby Kaigi, which I actually wasn't able to attend because my sister-in-law's wedding was the next weekend, I didn't actually know if they were going to like say anything, but then Mats went and talked about the project. So then I was like, oh, it's happening. Cool. So that was when it really started to kick off, and I transitioned off the YJIT team. They brought on 2 new people, and Kokobun and Jimmy Miller. And now I'm working full-time on this parser. I've been prototyping for a couple months now. Actually, I have a meeting coming up next month with people to show the progress that's been made so far. But yeah, it's still definitely in the prototyping phase, still early, but yeah, it's really exciting.
That is awesome. Something I'm trying to, just full disclosure, be better about is when we talk about things like parsers and things, maybe trying to help some newer folks to Ruby or people who are just familiar but may not familiar with parsers understand. So would you mind maybe just at a high level explaining kind of what a parser is specifically in Ruby, like how it's used?
When you load a file into any program, so CRuby is a program itself. It is a program written in C that accepts file paths and executes code inside of them. But the code is just plain text when it first receives it. So it's just a plain text file. It can be like JSON, YAML, anything. Like it's just in some kind of format. And the parser's responsibility is to take that plain text file and to transform it into a data structure that is understood by the program, by Ruby itself. And parsers can be used in myriad ways, but for a programming language implementation, the idea is to take that plain structure and transform it into a tree. Tree is kind of a generic term for a whole bunch of linked objects. There's a root node that represents the overall program. And then down, you'll start to see things that you actually recognize quite a bit from Ruby syntax. There just was never a name you put to it. But for instance, if you have a class definition, class foo end, that's going to be a node in the tree. If there are methods inside of that, that's going to be a node inside of that. And so you build up this big tree structure. And then various languages will do various things with that. CRuby, JRuby, and Rubinius, I guess, would all transform that tree into a series of bytecode instructions, which are just things that should be executed based on a stack. TruffleRuby will take that AST and transform it into what's called a sea of nodes, which is just another way of saying all bigger tree with different things on it that they can perform optimizations on and then execute. People tend to recognize trees really easily when you think about JSON. When you first receive JSON, you receive plain text and then you parse it and the tree is actually like right there. Like you can see the tree in JSON because that is JSON. It looks like a tree. Other things besides languages that would use a tree or a parser would be like a type checker or a linter or a formatter. All of those things require the syntax tree and the parser to create that tree.
So speaking of trees, syntax tree, How does this work together, if at all, with the work you're doing now on Ruby's parser?
So SyntaxTree uses Ripper. Ripper is this wild library in standard Ruby. It is absolutely crazy. Ripper is a parser that is created by using the grammar file created by CRuby. So grammar file is a way of creating parsers. What CRuby does is it uses something called Bison, which is a tool that's been around for a long time. It's a play on words from its predecessor, Yak, which was YACC, yet another compiler. Anyway, what Yak's stated mission was to take a grammar file, a .y file, and it's an EBNF format, but that's just to say it's in some kind of pseudocode for how to parse something, and then it generates a parser from that. So back before Ruby 1.9, in Ruby 1.8, there was a separate project that was created called Ripper outside of CRuby that used the exact same grammar file, except put a whole bunch of special comments, special like Ripper comments. They're C comments. They're like C code, but they're just comments. And then that was a DSL that then got transformed through the Bison and then through this other thing and created a whole nother thing that became an event-based parser. It got merged in Ruby 1.9 and it's been in there ever since. And if you look in the code, it still says early alpha version for the last 10 years. But anyway, so SyntaxTree is almost a successor of Ripper. It uses Ripper, but it puts named fields on every single node. In Ripper, everything is an array. A program node is an array with the first element is the symbol program, and then the next is an array of statements. And it just kind of goes down like that. SyntaxTree adds this whole like object-oriented layer on top of it that you can interact with. And the idea behind SyntaxTree is to make it so that if, for example, the parser underneath it were to change, the consumer of SyntaxTree would not have to deal with it. So this is the very long-winded way of getting to the answer to your question of like, how does this relate to the parser work I'm doing? If you are using SyntaxTree to do whatever you want to do, linting, formatting, anything, then it should be a transparent change to be able to swap in the new parser. And then you'll just reap the benefits of a faster parser with error tolerance without having to do anything to your program.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. Another thing you mentioned as well is that in the current state of the Ruby parser, it's not reusable outside of Ruby. You mentioned earlier, JRuby couldn't like use it to parse Ruby, right? Because it relies on the core CRuby library. Is that correct?
That's correct. Yeah. It uses the Ruby internals. It uses things like value, which is the C struct that, well, technically it's unsigned long, but it's the way that Ruby represents objects. And you have to basically link all of CRuby if you want to use the parser, which is not something that JRuby is going to do.
Yeah, because there's Rubinius, JRuby, now Truffle Ruby.
The PicoRuby,
yeah.
Natalie. Yeah.
Okay, I haven't heard of the last two you mentioned.
So mruby, the embeddable Ruby, PicoRuby is one for running on like tiny microcontrollers. I don't know a ton about it, but it was one of the Ruby Association grants 2 years ago or last year. But it's for running on very, very memory limited environments. And there's also Natalie, which is a C++ implementation of Ruby, which is a fascinating project. I spent my hack days PRs on it. It's really, really interesting. You should check it out. And there's also Ruby, which is a Rust Ruby. There's Artichoke. There's tons and tons. There's also Sorbet, which has its own parser baked in, which is ported from the typed Ruby compiler, which was a whole nother thing. So, yeah. Anyway,
so each one of these implementations, they either have to bring CRuby with it, or they're having to write their own parsers each time?
Yeah, there's different projects have taken different approaches. JRuby took the grammar file from Ruby 1.9 and rewrote it in Java. So they took the pseudocode and then they changed the C parts and changed it to Java. And then they've just been watching the upstream. Every time it changes, they go and try to match the semantics, but they're translating in their heads from C into Java every single time.
Wow.
Which is untenable. That is so much work. It's ridiculous.
Yeah, that's a massive undertaking.
It's a massive undertaking. It's mostly been undertaken by 2 people for 10 years.
Wow.
Absolutely wild.
I've never used JRuby. Like, I've installed it. I've never used it in production or anything.
Yeah.
But I've noticed new Ruby version comes out, JRuby. It takes just a little bit of time to get there. And that would, it would not only explain why, it makes it more impressive that they're able to keep up with that.
Oh, yeah. Hugely impressive. Yeah. Tom Anivo actually is helping me with the new parser. And he's been mostly dealing with all the parser changes upstream. And you got to think about like 2.7 introduced pattern matching syntax. It's a massive undertaking. Huge influx of syntax comes into the grammar file. All of a sudden, you have to port all of that C code over to Java. Good luck. So that, and then TruffleRuby originally started out with JRuby's parser and kind of still shares it, kind of doesn't. They have to stay up to date. The parser gem, which backs Rubocop, they have to stay up to date. Sorbet, which use typed Ruby, they're up to date because of work from Stripe employees, but also work from Shopify people on my team. They added pattern matching syntax to that parser. And it's every one of these parsers. There's so much work in this community going to duplicated efforts.
Yeah, that sounds painful.
It is. It's massively painful.
Okay, so we've got you and others working on a new Ruby parser. What are some of the goals of this project?
Yeah, 3 goals. 1, maintainability going forward. This current CRuby parser is mostly understood by about 3 people. Other people contribute, but the vast majority of the changes go through really 1 person, but kind of 3 people. That's obviously not great. There's really no documentation on how there is documentation. There's no English documentation on how the parser works. There is some Japanese documentation. Most of it's from around the time Yarv got merged. So it's not a great situation for approachability. So maintainability going forward, for sure. We want tests. We want clarity. Number 2 is portability, being able to use this outside of CRuby. So the end goal of this project is to build this as a shared library that other people can pull in without pulling in CRuby. So everything is being recreated on its own. There's no ties to CRuby. For instance, I just added a struct for a string. It exists now. It's like on its own, but it is divorced from the representation used by CRuby so that other projects can use it as well. And then error tolerance is like big part of this. The goal of this parser is to basically never segfault, never choke, never just die in the middle of parsing. At the very, very least, it should always return the root node of the tree at the very minimum. Even better is every syntax error is the smallest impact on the tree possible. If you see 1 plus and then nothing, it should build a node that's an addition node where the left side is 1 and the right side is just missing. So you should be able to have this tree built up with missing nodes, invalid nodes, any kind of node that represents what would have been there, but we can recover from all these kinds of syntax errors so that your IDE can represent all of those errors all at once.
Yeah, you mentioned some of the newer languages having like multiple errors, and I'd never even thought about that.
Yeah.
And I've seen it. When I used Crystal for the first time, I think it was Crystal, like Crystal told me like multiple places I messed up. I'm pretty sure it's Crystal. I know TypeScript does it. And I've never just thought like, oh, Ruby doesn't do that. Because I'm just so used to the workflow of like, oh, yes, it broke here. I need to fix that. And then it broke here.
It's amazing what we get used to, right? Because like when you're in an IDE with Ruby, you don't get the red squiggles.
Right.
You don't get the red squiggles. And I want my red squiggles. Those are incredibly nice. So part of this project is, I mean, this is a side.
Get the red squiggles.
But I want the red squiggles. I want to build a language server that interacts with this parser to display all syntax errors at once in your IDE. And honestly, I've been thinking about pausing the work on the parser and just building a language server right now because it's easier for debugging the parser itself when I can see the red squiggles.
Right.
Like I've just gotten so used to it. So I want my squiggles.
I'm like embarrassed when I talk about this, but like I get so jealous of tooling in other languages. And I feel like...
Don't be embarrassed. You absolutely should be. You absolutely should be jealous. Yeah.
At the end of the day, I have Ruby, but it's like, yeah, that's the reason I think I kind of latched on to like ES6 so heavily is like JavaScript tooling got a lot of investment. And I use VS Code and it is very smart when it comes to JavaScript. It's like, oh, you renamed this file. Would you like us to update all those imports for you? And it's like,
yeah, so nice.
Absolutely,
so nice.
I would.
Yeah, there's a whole future for Ruby that is going to happen. It's just going to take a long time. There is a future where we can have those kind of developer experiences, and it's going to be so nice.
I cannot wait.
Yeah.
I think you mentioned that someone from JRuby has kind of been alongside you in some of the parser work. Have the JRuby team or any other people kind of implementing their own flavors of Ruby hinted that they would use this new parser?
Yeah. I mean, I don't want to speak for them, but
sure.
JRuby has, the people behind it have said that they're open to it. PicoRuby has been actively contributing, so they're open to it. I believe the Sorbet team is open to reusing it. I got contacted by someone that wrote PicoRuby. He's interested in using it. Matt said he would replace his parser for mruby with it. And by extension, Artichoke uses the mruby parser. So Artichoke would then be using the new parser. And then Ilya, who helps maintain the parser gem, has been actively helping me with the new parser. So I imagine he might consider replacing or at least creating a new backend for the parser gem. So I think every single person that I have talked to just doesn't want to maintain a parser anymore. They're just like, why am I doing this? It's not the fun part of a language or a linter. That's not the fun part.
I just want to take a minute to thank our sponsor, Honeybadger. They are not only my favorite error and uptime monitoring service, but they've also added several awesome new features, one of those being the public status pages. So it makes perfect sense that your error and uptime monitoring tool can have a public status page for you to communicate any downtime outages with your customers. So whether US East 1 is down or you forgot to add a configuration file, Honeybadger is there for you to help communicate any downtime or outages with your customers. Plus, they've also added SSL certificate monitoring. So like many of us use these days, Let's Encrypt certificates expire every 90 days. And if for some reason you're a week away from expiring an SSL certificate, they can let you know ahead of time so that you can take care of it without any outages for your customers. Plus, managing the errors and things inside of Honeybadger has gotten even easier with Honeybadger Actions, which you can use to automatically assign errors to yourself or another team member, add tags to different error classes, and more. And they also have batch actions, which you can use on the search results to help manage your backlog of work to do. So Honeybadger is the place to check out for error and uptime monitoring, and it's only getting better. So check them out at honeybadger.io.
I'm sitting here thinking specifically about like JRuby. And every time something comes out that seems minute to like us developers, it's probably like, oh, we have to go update that.
Yeah.
And I think about how much time that takes away from like, oh, we could make performance improvements somewhere here in JRuby, or like all these other implementations. They could be doing the thing that makes their implementation unique. They could be spending time doing that. And that sounds awesome.
There's even a service that looks for commit changes on parse.y in Ruby, and then opens a new issue on the parser gem, because that's the only way to stay up to date, which is wild. I want to enable these people. These people could create such beautiful things if they were just freed up from having to maintain these things, these parsers.
That's amazing. So SyntaxTree kind of lives like in parallel with the parser.
Yeah, it's a level on top of the parser. SyntaxTree does a couple things right now, but the thing that is most valuable is that it provides a kind of like an object-oriented interface on top of the result of the parser. It doesn't do the parsing itself. But once the tree is built, what is the Ruby representation of that tree? And it depends on what parser you're using. If you're using the parser gem, you're going to get tree of, they call them node. It's a node class, and it has a bunch of children, and it's effectively an array with a type. And that's how it works. And if you're using, and that's the basis for ruby.ast, which is the basis for ruby. If you're using Ripper, it's a bunch of arrays. If you're using SyntaxTree, every node is a different object. You can literally go into node.rb in SyntaxTree, and I encourage you to, because I find it very readable because I wrote it. And every node, there is a class SyntaxTree program, and program node is the top of the tree. The program has a statements node that includes the list of statements. And within that, you can start to walk down the tree. You can see there's binary, which is like 1 + 2, ternary, which is 1 ? 2 : 3. There's assignment nodes, instance variable nodes, any of those kinds of things. And there's a node for every single one of those things. They all implement pattern matching. They all implement formatting. They all implement to JSON. You can do any of the things you would expect from a Ruby object. And I think it's a lot easier for Rubyists to interact with those objects than just random array indices.
No, this makes sense. That was the perfect explanation, because the missing piece for me is like, it takes the result of the parser and then translate to something maybe a little more familiar, I guess you could say.
Yeah. Easier to interact with. And it's funny because I actually didn't intend to build that. I intended to build a formatter. And SyntaxTree is a formatter, and it will format your Ruby code well and quickly. And I'm very proud of the formatting piece of it, because that was the original intention of the project. So you should all go use the formatting. But if you wanted to build other things on top of it, which Shopify is using it to build a language server, you can build any kind of thing on top of it that you want to.
Kevin, I don't know if you know this, but this file is 10,000 lines long.
Oh, yeah.
Did you write this by hand?
Yeah.
Holy crap.
There's a lot of comments. There's a lot of There's a lot of comments in there. But yeah.
Dude, I don't know. There's a lot of code in here. I mean, it looks very much like they're all inheriting from nodes, but dude, that's a lot of lines.
Yeah. It's funny because this project has been kind of in development for like 4 years now, because it started as Prettier and it was all in JavaScript. And then I ported it over.
You're a rock star.
There's a couple of files in that project that are quite large. Actually, there was when Richard Schneeman worked on a syntax suggest, he pulled that file into CRuby as a fixture because it caused syntax suggest to choke for like 5 seconds. So yeah, it's apparently being used for other reasons as well.
So with a new parser, will you have to make any changes to SyntaxTree to support reading the result?
Yeah, for sure. The new parser is going to have its own object representation, which is going to look extremely similar to SyntaxTree's, like extremely similar. So my plan is to slowly make major releases of SyntaxTree to slowly migrate it over such that at some point it's going to say SyntaxTree equals new parser, and then it's just going to be fine. There's a couple of differences that I'm making to, this is kind of getting in the weeds a little bit, but I'll try to make sense. But the idea is SyntaxTree is more tied to the syntax that you're using as opposed to the semantics that you're writing. So what I mean by that is SyntaxTree has one node for if modifier and one node for if. So if you use A if B, that is a distinct node from if A, B, end. Those two nodes semantically mean the exact same thing, but syntactically they're different. SyntaxTree was a direct layer on top of Ripper. Ripper delineates those two nodes. And so I delineated those two nodes in SyntaxTree. But when you write a language implementation, you don't care which one they used. It doesn't matter to you at the end of the day because you're still going to write a jump for the if statement. So like either way, it's the same thing for you. So to ease the burden of consumers of the new parser, a lot of the nodes are collapsed into each other like that. If modifier and if are the same node because there's just no need to have different nodes for that. There's actually no else if node in the new parser. It's just an if. It's just a chained, it's like a linked list of ifs because they're the same thing, right? At the end of the day. And then there's a couple of nodes that are exploded out. So for instance, in SyntaxTree, you have an assignment node. That's kind of annoying for language implementers because what kind of assignment is it? Is it local variable, global variable, instance variable, class variable? Or is it a method call? Like foo.bar equals 1, you're calling bar equals on foo. So there are tree that I'm using in the new parser is much more semantic. The one in SyntaxTree is much more syntactic. And my plan is over the next year and a half, 2 years while I'm building this thing, I'm just going to slowly make breaking changes. And like people that are using SyntaxTree are just going to like slowly get a tree that's closer and closer and closer to the new parser. And then one day I'm just going to flip it and no one's going to have to do anything. So
that's cool.
Yeah.
What really caught my attention there was when you were saying like there is no reason for else if you make it a linked list of if statements.
Right.
Is that a new idea? Like just the current one have else if or?
Yeah. So the SyntaxTree has an else if. Ripper has an else if. The parser gem doesn't.
Okay.
And neither does Ruby VM AST. There's all these different trees. I can see all the different representations and most of them don't bother with an else if because there's no need.
That's so fascinating.
Yeah. The difference between a parse tree and a semantics tree is like really interesting because in your head, you can see that some things like foo.bar equals look so similar to foo equals. It looks so similar, but those are completely different constructs in Ruby. One is a method call and one is a local variable assignment. So thinking about how your syntax actually translates and like some syntax is very similar, but means very different things. And some syntax is very different, but means the same thing. So it's really interesting to me, at least, to think about that difference.
Super interesting.
Yeah.
Talking about that, a question that came up is how difficult does metaprogramming make this type of work?
Not bad at all, actually. Metaprogramming really doesn't factor in too much because metaprogramming is just Ruby syntax. But on the other side of that, once the syntax tree is built, compiling it with metaprogramming, that becomes much more difficult. Fortunately, that is the end of my responsibility. My responsibility has been handed off at that point because I've already built the tree. And at that point, it's their responsibility to go and compile it. So if in CRuby, that's compile.c, which is a file that takes a syntax tree and compiles it into YAR bytecode instructions.
Gotcha. With some of these changes, one of the bits of tooling that maybe I assume or I've heard other people say is difficult. So like the reason we can't necessarily have nice tooling in Ruby is because we do metaprogramming.
Yeah.
Does the work you're doing help us be able to get that kind of tooling with metaprogramming?
It gets
in
closer.
Any fashion.
Yeah.
I won't hold you to like, let's make it do all of it.
It depends what you mean. So my tooling will make it much easier to deal with syntax errors. Like that is the goal. The next step is more advanced tooling builds something called a control flow graph. So code is going to go through a lot of transformation. It's plain text at first, then it's a tree. Then depending on your implementation, a lot of people convert that tree into a bytecode format, which is like push 1, push 2, add, which pops 2 off and puts the result back onto the stack. So like that's like bytecode. People will then take that bytecode and convert it into something called a control flow graph, which is much more similar to how you might imagine in your head things work. Think about control flow. Think about where the program is going to go. And think about if you have an if statement, how it's going to branch. And if you have an else, like it can like merge back together. It's much more similar to how humans think about code. And it turns out that once you have a control flow graph, you can start to analyze things like, is this variable ever reused? Is this, I mean, you can do that with a tree, but like it's easier with a control flow graph. You can start to see, is this method ever going to get called? More advanced things. And that's turns out really hard to do with Ruby because of all of the assumptions that you have to make. Like, hey, a C extension never got called that could have done any number of wild things. Eval never got called. You never overwrote an operator. Like you never did any kind of crazy stuff.
Right.
Yeah.
Does that kind of start to blur the lines of language servers?
Yeah. So language servers provide a way to give that kind of feedback to the user. And they typically will implement things in certain ways, but this is more like on the like the static analysis side.
Gotcha.
It's like Rubocop went super, super advanced.
Okay. I'm with you. Cool. I asked these questions. We are covering territory that I know so little about, but I'm so curious about. So I'm just going.
No worries. Yeah. I mean, honestly, I wish I had learned this stuff in school. I feel like I had no idea it even existed. And like, I don't know where you go to learn this stuff other than going to a big company with really smart people that teach you about it. Mm-hmm. Like 2 years ago, I couldn't have told you any of this information. And then I spent a year and a half on the Widget team and talked to Chris Seaton pretty often and talked to Aaron Patterson and like talked to like people that are much, much smarter than me. And I like slowly osmosis got a little bit of understanding of what I'm doing.
At Sin City Ruby, Drew Bragg gave we'll call it a talk. It was a game show.
Yeah.
And it was about weird things that Ruby does. And so it'd be like, if I do this, what's the expected output? And every time he would ask a question, I would just look at Chris Seaton and be like, he's going to know. And like, I would just wait for his answer. It was a lot of fun for me. So.
Yeah. Chris knows so many things about programming languages and his depth of knowledge with Ruby is pretty wild. So yeah, it's a different world. I mean, it's fascinating. I really wish it were less ivory tower. I really wish it were less unapproachable for most folks. At the end of the day, it's just programming. At the end of the day, it's just operating on structures. Like I'm not doing like B+ trees or red black trees, like some kind of like crazy data structure that's like super hard to understand. I'm just using arrays and hashes and stuff. But I think that people propagate this idea that it's super complicated for job security reasons. And that makes it hard.
Being fully transparent, I never have really felt like a real programmer. I know that sounds, I don't know, it sounds weird, but I felt like I just kind of learned enough as I went to like be good at web development. And so when I think of getting into Ruby, I think I'm not smart enough to do that. That's computer science majors. And I like had to drop out of computer science. So hearing you say things like this, like starts to like be like, oh, maybe I should go try and read about that. Cause
well, there you go.
It piques my interest very much.
Good. Well, let me say, first of all, that you are a real programmer and you do great work, and that we have a very odd fascination in this industry of celebrating the people who are one or more steps down the stack from us. So when I say stack, I mean like Ruby, C, assembly, microarchitecture. Like as we go down, we start to pretend that those are better or more real programmers, and they might be more experienced, but that is not to say that they're better or smarter or anything, but they have experience in very different areas. Most of the people that I work with closely on programming languages are very good at working on programming languages, but if you ask them to write some CSS, they might die. It's interesting because like we just spend our time in different areas, and it's hard sometimes because it does appear that they're doing like more advanced stuff or whatever, but it's just a different domain.
Yeah, that's it. We have so many domains in programming. It's not like 2 or 3.
No.
It feels like it's probably hundreds, thousands of domains.
Yeah. It's wild to me that programming is a profession, because to me, programming is a skill that goes along with another profession. It's like using Excel or running a good meeting. Programming is a skill. So like the entire idea of programmer as job is very strange at the end of the day. Like I think a lot of people say programmer and they mean, oh, I'm a web application developer. Okay, so that is your job. And you use programming as a tool to build web apps. Sure. My wife is a PhD in statistics and she does stata day in and day out. That's programming. But it's a skill that goes along with her job. It is not the job itself.
That is such a mind-blowing perception. I've never considered that, but it resonates with me.
I think it helps to think about it that way because people think that their job is to produce code, whereas their job is to solve problems. And if you can do it without programming, you've won.
Yeah. I have a week left of my sabbatical, and that gives me 7 days to chew on that. So
there you go.
Are you still working with Prettier Ruby?
I am. So I cheated.
Okay.
Prettier Ruby now spawns a Ruby process, requires SyntaxTree, and calls format.
Wow.
Prettier for Ruby is now 3 files. I love it so much.
That's amazing.
It's so much better than it was. So one of the biggest blockers for Prettier was that Prettier required a synchronous API. And in Node, you can't make a synchronous call to another process in Node. Can't be done. Straight up. Impossible. Without a C extension. C++ because it's Node. So what I was doing, this is the hackiest thing I've ever done. But what I was doing for Prettier Ruby, the way that it worked was it spawned a server, a separate Ruby process, which was just literally said loop do, right? That was a separate Ruby process that was running. And then the only way to get Node to block was to instantiate another process and wait for it to exit. So Prettier, for every single file it was going to format, it would instantiate a new project, a new file that would then call in to the other Ruby server, go back to that executable process, spawn out to standard out the formatted tree, and then exit. And then the parent process would read out of standard out the tree, all in JSON. Horribly inefficient, wildly hacky, but people used it in production. It's great. And then fortunately, Prettier got some donations that are being used to fund full-time work on Prettier, which is really, really, really good stuff. And for Prettier 3, they're switching to an asynchronous API. And now everything makes so much more sense because I spawn a server with Ruby. It's a Unix sockets on Mac or Linux, or it's just a TCP. You can think of it like a JSON server. It's basically a JSON server. And then in the parent Prettier process, I effectively am using fetch. I mean, effectively, that's what I'm doing is call over, get the response, get it back in JSON, done. So it's way, way better, much simpler, makes a lot more sense.
Is Prettier 3 out or is it still in?
It's got like 3 or 4 open issues. So it's almost there, but I've already migrated to the new version. They released an alpha release. The day Prettier releases V3, I will release a major version of Prettier Ruby.
You mentioned SyntaxTree does formatting, which obviously now you're just relying on like through Prettier. The advantage of still using Prettier is a consistent like API for like different languages.
So I really struggle with this. So there's not a lot of reasons to use Prettier Ruby anymore. If you're in a Ruby project, use SyntaxTree. Don't use Prettier Ruby. If you are in any kind of other project that is already using Prettier, you can get away with using it. I think one of the really nice things is that Prettier has enough of an ecosystem that they can do embedded language formatting, which is to say in a markdown file, when you have backtick Ruby, if you have the Prettier Ruby installed and you're using Prettier, it's going to format the Ruby inside that code block.
Whoa.
Yeah.
That's cool.
It's pretty slick. Prettier Ruby itself used to, it doesn't do it anymore, but it used to format here docs in Ruby with whatever formatter matched the name of the here doc. But anyway, all that is to say, there are some reasons for using Prettier Ruby. I don't encourage it. I think you should use SyntaxTree.
That kind of answers my next question, because I'm already used to running separate formatting process, not even process. It's just, it's separate formatting commands, because we use standard at Prettier. Right. So I'm used to using standard for Ruby, but I use Prettier personally. So on like JavaScript and stuff. So I'm used to kind of being siloed a bit. Yeah. So like just adopting SyntaxTree isn't too far off.
SyntaxTree has a whole segment of its doc that's integrations. So I actually support a VS Code plugin that is like the standard one that you can hook into, which like you can format on save, which is really, really nice. And it's like orders of magnitude faster than RubyCop. You can also hook it into Rake. Almost all of my projects have Rake stree write or Rake stree check, which is really pretty easy to integrate. It ships with a RuboCop config that you can inherit from to turn off the style rules that would violate RuboCop, or at least the ones that RuboCop shouldn't care about anymore once SyntaxTree is involved. So there are ways to integrate it into your workflow.
All of this is much like last time we talked. I find this also like exciting and encouraging, but also I want to say you're very thoughtful. Like the last thing you were talking about, like with RuboCop config to work with SyntaxTree, like that is a level of detail that I appreciate.
Yeah, no worries. I mean, I want people to use this thing. Formatters save a lot of discussion. You don't have to, right? I think standard RB lives up to that banner as well, of like just eliminating the need for a lot of discussion. I think SyntaxTree does it. I think there's still an open issue in my head. It's not on the repo, but in my head, there's still an open issue of what's the best way to integrate RuboCop and SyntaxTree into the same project. I don't know the answer to that question. I wish I did. I don't know how other languages do it, to be honest. I've been in the Rust ecosystem for a little bit, and Clippy and Rust Clippy is their linter, and Rust format don't intersect. They just don't. Clippy is for linting, and Rust format is for formatting. And obviously, we don't have that situation in the Ruby ecosystem. We have RuboCop, which does everything. And then we have all these other formatters that are cropping up to try to take the place of its formatting rules. So I don't know the right answer right now.
Do the linter and the formatter in Rust agree on the syntax?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. But it's also all standard. Rust core team maintains that stuff, which changes the game quite a bit. Rust also has quite a bit more funding than Ruby does, which also changes the game quite a bit.
Unfortunately, I feel like that's a lot of other languages.
Yes, most other languages. Yes. I think Ruby is quite an outlier.
It's pretty amazing to hear the things you're working on and other people at Shopify and Stripe and all these other companies are working on, given the fact that, like you said, Ruby is an outlier. So I think...
Yeah. Ruby hasn't really had a massive influx of money, really at any time in its history. 2008, 2009, that was a big time for it. But right now, I think probably is the most money that's ever been put into Ruby. Stripe, GitHub, and Shopify are all putting in quite a bit of money. I think Shopify is probably putting in the most, to be honest. I hear interesting rumblings on Twitter about like, oh, the big companies are taking over. And like, I saw some tweets or whatever. I'm subtweeting right now. I saw these like tweets about like, oh, the big companies, I need the big companies to go away. And it's like, okay, just so you know, they're the ones putting the money into the language. So I'm all about some like good esoteric gems that are nice and fun to use. But if you want a faster language, you need money. And if you want money, you have to go to big companies because small companies cannot afford it.
It was like the gas pedal got hit on JavaScript. It seemed like
my goodness.
The year.
Yes.
And Google and all these companies just started putting
massive
money. And honestly, like when Aaron Patterson, I can't remember where he was before, maybe it was Red Hat, but whenever he went to GitHub, I was like a sigh of relief. That means that Aaron's going to keep working on Ruby because GitHub is going to have him work on Ruby. And then like everyone on your team basically at Shopify is just like, oh, okay. Like people are getting
I don't know
paid.
if people realize how huge my team is. My team is like 50 people. It's wild. I mean, there's people working on so many different parts of the Ruby ecosystem. It's really, I mean, it's a moment. And I'm desperate for it to never end because it is so fun working on this team, to be honest. I feel like a shill, but it is kind of amazing at this moment in time to see not only that, but we have meetings with GitHub's Ruby team. We have meetings with Stripe and Gusto's Ruby teams. And, you know, it's nice to make sure we're all synced up and that everyone is working toward a brighter future, so to speak. it's nice to see this from behind the curtain, so to speak, because I had never worked at a big company until this before. And seeing how it works and how people are just so invested in the future of this language. And I was cynical before I joined Shopify. I was like, they're just in it for Shopify. They're just doing it for themselves. And like some of the work is for Shopify payloads, of course. They have to like make business value for the company. But man, they are invested in the language itself, which is really very encouraging.
Yeah, I think the last conversation I had with someone on your team, it was like, and it's not just Ruby, it's like the Rails ecosystem too.
Yeah, I mean, Raphael is on the team. He's constantly working on Rails. He's got an entire team under him. There's a team working on Ruby gems signing and MFA infrastructure and general supply chain security, I guess is what they would say. We have teams working on what the future of Rails could look like in terms of infrastructure and layout of models and what's like a sustainable way to keep things from having like 1,000 methods. Even just like Jean on my team, Jean Boussier, he created a reimagined version of Unicorn called Pitchfork. And it's brilliant. I mean, it's absolutely brilliant. It takes advantage of copy on write. It's much smarter about warming up memory caches. And it's just like seeing some of these people at work is really kind of wild. I'll stop.
No, I appreciate your passion for it because it gets me excited. And as much as it feels like Rails is doing well right now, I look at other ecosystems with envy. So having people like you and the rest of your team excited, I want you to share that as much as you can. So.
Yeah, I want to. I mean, this is one of the reasons why I'm here. It's an exciting time. I honestly think that this is one of the best times to be in Ruby. I think we're going to see a pretty wild shift in developer tooling. I think we're going to see enhanced security. It's a pretty good time. And the people working on it are just very, very invested.
I think that is a perfect place to wrap this one up. Andrew, do you have anything?
Earlier, you were talking about binary trees, and I've been like reminiscing about college ever since.
Have you been thinking about class and the work or like college lifestyle?
No, as soon as he said that, my brain like put me back into like my seat in computer science class, staring at these freaking trees. And I'm like, so much complicated tree math that I had to do.
Yeah.
I don't envy what you're having to deal with. That's complicated.
I find it frustrating to talk about those advanced data structures because I'm a musician. I like studied music in school, and studying data structures exclusively is like, to me, it's like teaching someone music by exclusively letting them write or perform scales. That's the only thing they can play. You can only play scales. No, you don't listen to real music, just scales. And it's like, I don't care about a data structure until I see its application. It's so frustrating to me to go to those classes and be like, this is this algorithm, this is this data structure. And it's like, well, show me when it's really going to get used.
Yeah, that was my big problem too, is like, you have to memorize all these different algorithms and like you have to do all this math with these binary trees and the ASTs and balancing them and searching and all this other crap. And you have to do it on paper. And we're never going to tell you how it's applicable into your real life.
Oh, and by the way, you can't use a search engine.
No, absolutely.
Even though that's all of my life is Googling for stuff.
Yeah, you have to implement these algorithms from scratch using a language that we barely taught you like 3 years ago.
And I understand the value of understanding fundamentals, but there's got to be a way to teach fundamentals and overviews and get a broad understanding without that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I got 10 points off a test one time because I left a semicolon off the end of a Java line.
No.
My thought was, well, if I was a computer, like a compiler would have told me this and it would be fine. And at that point, I went to a spiral and I dropped out.
I mean, we do this to people, right?
Yeah. So many people I started with in computer science school were not there at the end.
Yeah.
It was discouraging.
This is why I go back to thinking about programming as a skill and not a job, because there's got to be a way. I mean, boot camps have kind of shown, in my opinion, that you can teach it as a skill. I think that there's a future where you don't study computer sciences. So, I mean, I'm sure there'll be academics that study computer science, but you don't study programming as its own class. You learn programming as a part of other classes. You already do that with like a physics or astronomy or any number of other majors. Econ. I mean, even math majors will just use Excel for a bunch of stuff, which is itself programming.
Yep. Or write calculator programs.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I remember my TI.
Yep.
Well, this has been fun. For those listening, where can people find you? Where can they reach you to ask all their questions in your DMs?
Find me on Twitter at KDD Newton or GitHub KDD Newton or any other places at KDD Newton.
Kevin, it's been a blast. Thank you for coming and talking with us about this. Let me ask all my wild questions.
Thanks for having me. Yeah. Any other questions, feel free. I mean, this is a topic that we as a community are going to someday demystify. We're all going to just like inherently understand it as Rubyists, and it's going to be beautiful.
Can't wait. Well, on that note, Andrew, I will see you next week.
Yes, sir.